Susan M. Schneider, Engineer Turned Behaviorist by Andy Miller. Susan M. Schneider is currently a visiting scholar at the University of the Pacific in California. She's the author of many articles and a book intended for the public called The Science of Consequences. She continues to write, teach, give presentations, and enjoy her pets and gardening. She covers a broad range of topics in her writing, but her most important research has been on newborn birds. She demonstrated that extremely young birds display learned behavior, much like adults. Susan Schneider, originally a student of mechanical engineering, became friends with B.F. Skinner, and that friendship, along with the Peace Corps and other life experiences, led her to pursue a career in behavior analysis. On her book website, she stated about Skinner, "After I joined the Peace Corps as an engineer, he sent a handwritten note wishing me bon voyage and saying how proud he was of me. But naturally, he was very pleased when I eventually switched to behavioral psychology, now called behavior analysis." I read and surprisingly enjoyed her book. I also found many articles she wrote interesting, and they were often not directly about her work, but the work of others. Even her scholarly articles about her own research were interesting, even though the vocabulary and concepts were challenging to me as a beginner. The scientific methods and challenges of behavior analysis might have had similar appeal to her interest in mechanical engineering. What is refreshing is she maintains a love of nature and the environment, and that passion becomes integrated into her scientific work. She leaves behind not a sterile body of work from the lab, but rather shows how the science is intertwined with beauty. Contributions to the literature. The Science of Consequences merges many of her article topics and makes them accessible to the average reader. She touches upon many of the same themes as her scholarly writing. Through her examples of how consequences shape the responder, her love of the natural world comes through and is right there in the preface. Every day our actions have consequences, large and small. A completed chore, a smile, a promotion. Consequences motivate. Newborns work to hear their mother's voices. Toddlers graduate to turning lights on and off for that lovely, surprising feeling of control. A kaleidoscope of consequences awaits. Especially in the Science of Consequences, she utilizes examples from multiple members of the animal kingdom to show how universal the science of behavior is. She links the behaviors of flatworms, fruit flies, birds, crabs, rats, and primates, including humans young and old. For example, on page 21 to 22, she describes excitement reinforcement through dancing pigeons, sliding otters, current surfing blowfish, and humans on a roller coaster. As her book continues, the point of view gradually becomes wider. Starting with genes, she moves on to brain development, interaction with the sensory world, the animal kingdom, and finally on to how we can change the world itself. In and through this expanding point of view, she touches on all the patterns and mental processes that deal with consequences. Most of the scholarly work I found was about her research on birds, quail specifically. She not only continued the behaviorist tradition of operant chambers, but even looked at how breeding and environmental conditions produce better learners amongst quail and other birds from infancy. Another repeated theme in her work is the very specific aspect of nature versus nurture and a false dichotomy. Traditionally, this dichotomy has been the debate over whether behaviors result from characteristics we are born with or the behaviors we learn from prior consequences. Normally, one would expect a writer or researcher to conclude our behavior as the result of both and take a stance as to how strong one influence is over the other or how integrated they are. Her arguments are unexpected because she addresses the microenvironment of gene replication. She sets the philosophical debate aside as her research shows that consequences can not only determine what genes are activated, but even what genes the offspring will activate. She addresses many other aspects of this dichotomy, including calling it a false dichotomy, and again going about how integrated nature versus nurture is. But her work on the genetic environment is what I found to be the most interesting. She delves into some history and a history of the term radical behaviorism from Watson to Skinner. The phrase radical behaviorism is forever tied to Skinner's work, but actually existed before his first use of the term. In the article, she covers 3 different definitions of radical, which will all be added to behaviorism and met every way until the phrase eventually gained its 4th separate meaning as its own concept, much like the phrase of Gothic architecture going from once derogatory to a very sound design philosophy. Her point is that understanding these 3 definitions in history can provide insight into the philosophy itself. Radical can either mean extreme, a significant change from established thought, or politically radical, which, given the time frame, applies to socialism or communism. Extreme became the most commonly applied meaning of the term and was usually applied to Watson's work, even though he never used it. Skinner freely used the words radical behaviorism enough to become the person with the closest association, even though he never claimed to have coined it. Schneider quoted a personal communication from January 31st, 1985, when he wrote, "I don't believe I invented the phrase radical behaviorism. I think it was in the air at the time." She explores behaviorism's philosophic history and Back to Our Philosophical Roots, a journal review of transactions of the Charles S. Peirce Society. This is more than simply a journal review, as she further explores many of the same concepts that are in the journal. In particular, the philosophy of pragmatism, which believes that meaning and value of idea depends simply on how useful it is, as opposed to more metaphysical arguments. For example, Greek literature frequently explored a lack of free will in terms of fate or interference from supernatural gods. A pragmatic behaviorist would look at the idea differently because they would see a lack of evidence for free will in behaviors and a preponderance of evidence suggesting that behavior was caused by many observable phenomena outside the realm of free will. She mentions that pragmatism was a distinctly American contribution to the world of philosophy, only to be replaced by logical positivism. She argues that by looking back at the period of pragmatism, behaviorists can find the necessary foundational belief to their science. In working with the mock interview, I got enough to try to kind of answer for her, at least make a good guess as what she might say. I was pretty interested in knowing what was her interest in mechanical engineering, and did that same interest apply to behaviorism. I think that mechanical engineering is systematic and must have become much more interesting when applied to behavior. It's not uncommon for engineers to get bored with their work. People have been using birds to study behavior for a long time. What caused you to focus on newborn birds when adults are already so successful to researchers? It would seem a common link that when baby humans have shown how much consequences shape future behavior, that same link might be explored in animals. If your career started now with more options for renewable energy, what do you think you would be doing? I imagine she would have gone down the energy route, as she was very passionate about the time but had very few opportunities. However, it's impossible to tell which way a career is going to go. How interconnected is your professional work to your love of nature, pets, and your interest in the environment? I think her research in Skinner's was frequently motivated to improve the world through every creature learning compatible behavior. Humans especially, but she noted that trained pets, farm animals, and zoo animals appear to have much happier lives after going through some training. Which do you find more difficult, writing for the public, such as in The Science of Consequences, or your scholarly work? Is it like writing in two separate languages? I think her career as a teacher aided her in writing her book, and that, plus having a good editor, always makes a big difference. And the implications of her work with quail showed that the neonates, or the newborn quail chicks, nearly demonstrated the generalized matching law to the same degree as adults. Her work has a meta-quality to it, meaning it goes beyond the act of studying animal behavior. She studies how to improve the very tools used to do her research. What also struck me was that the study was sensitive to animal stress, presumably because as a researcher you would want to rule stressful stimuli out as motivating operators. However, I think it also shows a sensitivity to the subjects being studied. The study even mentions that because the species is social, especially given the exceptionally early age, that artificial surrogate birds were placed in the chamber to ease stress as the young chicks were learning operant behavior. In The Tangled Tale of Genes and Environment, Moore's The Dependent Gene, The Fallacy of Nature versus Nurture, she goes more in depth into a lot of what she covers in The Science of Consequences, Chapter 3 on genes, by reviewing Moore's work. For example, on page 95 of The Tangled Tale, she discusses the idea of heritability, or the passing of traits to offspring that is not done through the developmental environment. She shows how this is not as clear-cut as you would think, because it means far more than DNA or genes passed on to offspring. Since genetic material is often dormant due to environmental and heredital factors, this makes the concept of heritability more difficult and less useful to define. Heritability is just one concept discussed as a misconception of the nurture versus nature discussion. Studies on identical twins raised separately also led to a number of misconceptions. Similarities between twins are attributed to genetics when they are more likely to be attributed to sharing a common culture and experiences. At the end of the paper, she summarized Moore's book on how complicated the argument is and that the same information fuels a significant portion of the science of consequences. It's difficult to judge her overall contributions to the field because I've only a limited understanding of the field in general. In an interview by Sheila Haberad, you get a sense of Susan Schneider's contributions and assessment of what she feels is needed. In regards to education, she notes progress has been made, but also that many teachers have absolutely no knowledge of behavior analysis. Their education training has completely lacked behavior analysis. She also feels there needs to be a lot more basic research, and many researchers today need better training in scientific methods. Her work reinforces many themes in this class. She describes a web of consequences that work together to determine behavior. This mirrors the way this class does away with explanatory fictions to be replaced by prior consequences. She illustrates this when she goes in depth to the scientific-sounding myths around nature versus nurture. I appreciate her emphasis on science-based methods and her ability to explain those results as if we were having an actual conversation. Her book in particular adds to understanding what we cover in class. While the class lecture has an emphasis on vocabulary and subtle differences in concepts, I feel her book provides a generalized knowledge and understanding to really make use of those formal concepts. Susan Schneider has made a career out of numerous contributions. Her studies on quail demonstrate very targeted scientific discovery. Her numerous articles present a wider view incorporating philosophy, history, and other disciplines to add knowledge to the field of behavior analysis. In her field, she is an advocate for sound scientific principles and also collaboration. In her book, she also shows her ability to relate scientific discoveries to behavior we all witness every day. She also advocates for more popular knowledge of how consequences affect behavior. In effect, if we were all a little better trained, we'd be happier and we'd be better at helping others obtain that happiness, whether others means our pets, our students, or our own behaviors.